worries me that the government is starting to name and shame, of course, anybody who has that much power.
Well, how do you feel as a Californian about the tax delinquent list?
I think California's taxes are already way too high.
But what about not paying them entirely? Which is what the list is, right? That you shame the top 500 tax delinquents in the state. Yeah. Get a letter that say your name will go online if you don't pay up. Some of them owe $3 million, $5 million, $10 million in back taxes.
My initial reaction is I can't stand any sort of abuse of power that way. I think there's a better way to do it, maybe not. My other reaction is I think California has been taxing people at such a high rate anyway. So I'm probably the wrong person to ask because I have an emotional reaction to that, which is probably not on the side of the government. But if I had to be really objective about it, and I was trying to solve a problem as a government employee, I think it's effective. I worry about that precedent. I worry about the government taking your anonymity and exposing you because you broke a law. There are enough laws on the books already when you evade taxes that you can go to jail and you get audited and things like that.
Yeah, but the difference
when
is...
the government
you can't go to jail at the state level.
No, but when the government is in the business of humiliating somebody,
but Brian,
I have a problem with it.
Let me ask you this. Let's say that you've got somebody who hasn't paid all of their taxes. What do you think the consequence of that is for you?
Well, I don't know.
Well, take a wild guess.
I don't know, but
taxes get raised. Part of the reason why your taxes are so high is because you've got people who are defectors from the community and don't pay their taxes. And when you have all these people who don't pay their taxes, the only option is to raise the taxes on the whatever percentage that do pay.
I'm not sure I agree with you, but I'll grant you that argument. I'm not so sure. It goes back to, if you can shame somebody for not paying their taxes and you're the government and you can do with their anonymity as you please, you can do that with a lot of other things. And I think it sets a dangerous precedent, and I'm never in favor of some centralized power like the federal government, like the state government, making that decision, having a council meeting and deciding we're going to expose these people because they don't pay their taxes. I don't think that's the most effective way, and frankly, I think taxes are too high. I paid.
Yeah, but part of the reason why they're too high is because
that's
these
not
people.
True.
That is
that's
true.
That's not why they tax higher.
You just granted me that point and then withdrew it.
I'm not granting you that point.
You did, though.
That's not why California has high taxes.
It's part of it.
It's because government knows how to do that, and they know how to raise taxes and pass laws.
Oh, Mike Callan is
But it's true.
Yeah.
But it's true. I mean, everybody, a government, I'll tell you what a government always needs, more money. They just do. Why? Because they're human beings and they want to solve problems. Well, how do you solve a problem when you're in government? We need money. We'll raise taxes. They'll keep doing that until you get to 70%.
Let me ask you this, Brian. Do you think we use shame on our politicians? Do we think
we do? But I think you've entered into that is a contract you've entered into as a public figure.
Well, as a citizen, you've entered into a contract to pay your taxes. Like, if you don't want to pay your taxes, you can pull in Eduardo Saverin and give up your U.S. citizenship and go move to Singapore.
Let me ask you and Jennifer a question. Then, if that's the case, paying taxes and they're delinquent, and so the government is taking the 500 most egregious violators of this and they're exposing them. Okay, how about this, guys? Why don't we do the same thing with people who commit adultery?
Firstly, is that something that is the government's responsibility?
It hurts children. You can make that argument.
Yeah, but the point is that the government's responsibility? And you also have to allow that if the government misuses shame, when people misuse shame, that's the point, and that's part of the point of the book.
Well, that's the question, though, Jennifer. Is this? Do you not believe that's a misuse of shame, or do you support the government?
No,
that is in fact what the church, who acted as the government, used to do. That was the premise of the Scarlet Letter.
Exactly.
But that wasn't my point, Brian.
Okay, but wait, Jennifer, speak to that for a sec.
Well, there are two things that are interesting about that example. One is that we no longer view the case of adultery to be really in the realm, I think this is your point too, Hunter, of the state. That's not really the state's business, except when it comes to actually about, divorce settlements. Mm-hmm. Then it does, play a role.
Sure.
And then the other question is, and I think you're trying to make the point about children, is to what extent can you argue that this behavior really has an effect on society at large? And I'd argue that in the tax case, it's a much stronger example. In the same way, it's a much stronger example with secondhand smoke than it is with obesity or, in this case, adultery.
We're still talking about degrees here, Jennifer, though. We're still talking about degrees.
Yeah, but as soon as you start using thin end of the wedge arguments, Brian, then you can stop us from doing anything. Everything is potentially a slippery slope, but you have to make certain choices. I mean, if the government starts policing people's right to murder, then the next thing you know, they'll be policing adultery. The point is that if the government, and yes, Jennifer, those were the points that I was making, but I would also add another one, which is that if the government abuses the use of shame, if the community feels that they're going too far with that stuff, let me tell you, the community will lash out so fast.
Until, Hunter, you have a council on shame. Until you have a shame czar.
That's the point
right?
No, Brian, listen.
But isn't that what happens?
Can I be appointed?
Yes. Jennifer, you will. I all my meat rights, I won't get any bacon. It's going to be outrageous.
But actually, I'll put an end to comedy in general.
You're so mean. You're so beautiful, yet so mean.
But yeah, that's the point is that, listen, look at social media. People try and go too far with things. They slap people back. Like there's a constant back and forth that happens. And, what
I'm saying to you right now is I think what you just asked me my point of view on that, Jennifer did. And I'm saying my slap back is I think that's an abuse of power.
Well, that's fine.
When you expose,
but Brian, let's talk. Listen.
Taxpayers.
Since this is in the news, this couldn't get more relevant. What do you think the problem is in Greece? A huge part of the problem in Greece is that they lived under the Ottoman Empire. They therefore didn't pay their taxes because they're like, why should I pay taxes to an imperial overlord? The Greeks think of paying your taxes as theft,
right?
And the result is you don't have a functioning economy. Now, fortunately, we don't have the level of tax defection in California or in the U.S. that they have in Greece. But at the extremes, tax defection becomes a real problem. And if I've got a choice, Brian, between passing legislation, because that's the point, as Jennifer said, it is not a crime at the state level to defect on your taxes.
It's not a crime, Jennifer?
No, there's no state debtor's prison, only at the federal level.
Right.
Really?
Yeah. So if you've got a choice between a new law that sends more people to prison, which is expensive, and publishing,
and will raise your taxes,
or putting out a list of 500 people, and it's a list online, and that hopefully gets some of them to pay more of their taxes, and putting up that list costs
$100,000 a year.
Yeah.
And they've gotten over $400 million in back taxes. And the really interesting point about this that I think does help address some of your concerns, Brian, is just that the threat of exposure leads people to pay their taxes. They get a letter that says your name will go on this list, and that's when they decide to pay, before there's any humiliation, before they've been listed online. And you're not talking about people who can barely scrape together the money. You're talking about millionaires who have decided based on an ideology or whatever. It's hard to know for certain their motivations, but it's not for lack of cash.
I'm just excited I don't get put in jail for not paying my state taxes.
Exactly.
But they did. The U.S. government did something very interesting with the Swiss bank accounts. A lot of people were hiding money in the Swiss bank accounts, and they said to people, we are going to. The Swiss government is going to grant us access, I think, to 50% or 30% of all the bank accounts, and you can take a risk. You can decide not to divulge how much money you have in Swiss bank accounts. But if you're one of the 30%, and we find out that you're going down, we're coming after you with everything we have. And guess what? People went, I don't want to take a 30% chance, 50% chance I'm going to jail. So here's all my information. So that was one case where a threat of jail was, but Jennifer, it goes back to this. I didn't know actually that you couldn't go to jail for being delinquent on your state taxes.
No.
But you can be docked your pay when you're audited. Can't they put a lien on your paychecks and things? I mean, you will pay a price for that, right?
Well, a lot of I'm not an accountant or a lawyer, but my understanding from speaking, I did speak to the tax people in California, and by the way, 20 other states have this policy as well, but is that they can work to confiscate some of your goods, but only second homes and luxury vehicles. And this takes an enormous amount of resources at the state level to try to get those assets under state holding.
You both make a good argument if it costs less and it's not it's not as coercive. I could be swayed.
Yeah, $100,000.
I love it when people change their minds.
Yeah, $100,000 in cost for $400 million in revenue, Brian. That's like investing.
Damn it, Hunter.
That's like investing in Facebook in
Let
2004.
the market decide.
Yeah.
For God's sake, you guys, you're shifting my paradigm right now, and that's what this show's all about: changing our mind. That's why we have people like Jennifer Jacquet on our podcast. Jacquet. I just like Jacquet. Jacquet.
I'm happy with either.
Assistant professor of environmental studies at New York University. I'm jealous. Are you in New York City right now?
I'm not, actually. I'm on the West Coast. If you'd told me, I would have done this at a more reasonable hour.
You could have
Where
come in.
are you?
We're in the West Coast.
I'm actually I'm afraid to admit this, as I've seen some of your reactions so far, but I'm in Canada.
Oh, well, my favorite place to perform. We're in Canada. It's my favorite place.
Vancouver.
Love Vancouver.
Wow.
I'll be
Brian's
right.
huge in Canada.
Sell out 2 weeks in advance, ladies and gentlemen. Anyway, I'm sure you're very impressed.
Okay, great.
Yeah, this is me lecking. Am I lecking or just
You
showing
are
off?
lecking.
I'm just
It's
showing
the
off.
same thing, Brian.
They need some humor up here, you know.
It's some of my favorite audiences. My favorite audiences are either in Miami or in Canada. It's either very south or very north. It's really interesting. But anyway, Jennifer, thank you for doing this podcast. You've taught me some stuff, not only with your book, but with your discussion, and you might even have changed my small mind.
Well, thanks for reading. It was apparent that you actually did it.
And the book is, Brian?
Is Shame Necessary? I'm not even reading this out. I just know it. New uses for an old tool. And I think, Jennifer, this is probably the most Hunter and I have gone back and forth. We've been fighting essentially over you. So
I guess I feel honored.
You should.